The other figure that I think was an important model for him was Chaplin. People talk about him looking a bit like Chaplin on stage in the early days, that he had this Chaplin-esque quality, and he would do little things. His movements were sort of stylized, as though he'd been studying Guthrie or had just intuitively absorbed him. And Chaplin was a similar figure. The Little Tramp is a very similar figure. That he's an everyman who's also a no-man. We know nothing about him, but he represents all of us in a way. And Chaplin, when sound came, he realised that he was faced with a dilemma, which he astutely took the right choice, I think. Although he wavered, he tried out the other option. But he realised that the Little Tramp could not speak, because as soon as the Little Tramp was tied to a language, to English, he would lose his power, he would lose his universality. And Chaplin was, we sort of forget how big a figure Chaplin was. Chaplin was the first media superstar. He signed, the first entertainer to sign $1 million contract. He signed $1 million contract in 1914. He was known and understood all over the world. I mean, in a way, he was more universal than anybody has been since, because his art didn't depend on language. People understood it all over the world. From, in India, in the Middle East, they revered and still revere the Little Tramp, the Chaplin figure. And Chaplin realised when sound came, if he made the Little Tramp speak, he would become American, or he would become an English speaker. He would lose a huge part of what he was. So the first sound film he made, which is also the last Little Tramp film, is Modern Times, which is a title, of course, that Dylan has used more recently, and I don't think accidentally, in which the Little Tramp does make sound for the first time. He sings a song, but he sings it in a nonsense language. It's a beautiful song, a song in no language. There are words in the film, but they all come from machines. The sort of screens and speaking machines that say things. But the Little Tramp never speaks. And after that, when Chaplin realised that he was going to have to deal with sound, in a sense he killed the Little Tramp. The figure of the little Jewish barber in The Great Dictator has echoes of the Little Tramp, but it isn't quite the Little Tramp figure. And I think he was, whether unconsciously or consciously, a very important part of how Dylan modelled himself in those early years. So the thesis about folk that I felt I never quite brought round to us into a circle was most of that material. One thing that's changed for me since I first wrote the book, I'm going to stop talking about the book in a few minutes and talk about other stuff which isn't in the book, and more directly about Dylan. One thing that's changed, certainly since I started writing the book, it's really, to me, it's amazing that when I started to write it in the early 80s, and I realised I was going to have to sort of, I knew I liked early blues and I knew a bit of it, but and I think I'd heard Woody Guthrie, but I didn't really know anything much about him. And in those days, there were no Woody Guthrie LPs in print in Britain, for example. To get any of the early blues people, you had to buy really expensive import LPs. It was just hard to come by that stuff. And that's now you can have complete digital libraries of, vast libraries of American folk music at no expense if you go to the wrong places on the internet. But even if you buy it in box sets, you can get sort of boxes and boxes of stuff, the whole works of Blind Willie McTell or whatever for a tenner, and that's a big difference for me. It just means that I feel I know more about that roots music than I did when I started writing the book. I think it's also been a big difference for Dylan. It's interesting that Dylan's work in the last 10 years has become absolutely sown with references, more than references. They're kind of collages of of existing folk music, which would be, you know, if I'm going to talk about that slightly in the second half. What are they? Is it plagiarism? Is it allusion? Is it borrowing, theft? You know, what is it? Whatever it is, it seems to me that that goes hand in hand with digitisation. That Dylan, in a way, can put all that stuff in and know that within hours of getting the record, his more obsessive fans like me can have traced, you know, hundreds of those references just by Googling phrases, finding out which songs they've come from, which books, whatever. So that it's interesting that, like, Modern Times, which is a very old-fashioned sounding record, which totally echoes kind of pre-rock and roll, Dylan's very earliest childhood music. It's like 40s American pop music, even earlier. I mean, a lot of it sounds like Bing Crosby, you know, it's a 30s music. So it's a very ironic title, Modern Times. It's a very unmodern sounding record. But in that respect, it seems to me a very, you know, it is a modern record, a very internet-ready record that he knows that people can trace all those threads if they want to. They can find out where all that stuff is coming from, what it alludes to, what it pulls into his songs, you know, pulls in with it. Yes. So, sorry. The circle I felt hadn't quite completed was the idea that, in a way, Dylan himself had closed the circle that had been waiting to be closed for a long time in the relation between romantic poetry, which is really, I think, all poetry since the Romantic rebellion, Romantic movement in the late 18th century, early 19th century. He brought modernism, modernist poetry, and folk music. He closed that cycle. In a way, that spark that runs through that mid-60s stuff is kind of the spark of those two ends coming together. Here's folk music and literary modernism, romantic poetry, really rich, you know, elusive, symbolic poetry.